Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Jason Joel. I'm a product marketing manager here at MuleSoft, and I'm joined today by my colleague Jamil Patel, who is a senior technical product marketing manager on my team here at MuleSoft. And today we're going to be talking to you about extending AWS with MuleSoft. So let's get started. So before we dive in, I want to remind and ask the audience to make all purchasing decisions based on what is generally available and not based on any forward-looking statements made here. Second, just a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. If you missed something, we'll send you a recording of today's webinar, so don't worry. Second, if you have any questions, don't wait until the end of the webinar. You can ask them right away through the submit a question widget on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll try our best to give you a shout out and answer the question. And lastly, we love feedback, so please rate this webinar by selecting the survey widget at the bottom of the screen. So let's get started. And today we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the playbook for integrating AWS. So this starts with building integrations from AWS to anywhere, moving into how to deploy integrations on or with AWS, and then finally scaling those integrations through reuse. And the first thing I want to do is kind of address, why have we chosen to talk about AWS today? And I've been absorbed with AWS these last few weeks because of AWS reInvent and some of the inspiring topics that they've been talking about at the event. So part of that reason is because AWS has played a dominant role in the cloud market, making up over 45% of market share according to Gartner, and this was shared in the keynote. And then, this is definitely impressive. I think said another way, 45% of you watching today probably have AWS running, whether you know it or not, at your organizations. But part of it is also this other stat that was shared, which is that cloud for total IT spend, cloud only makes up 4%, while on-premises makes up 96%. So I think this is a really cool stat because it shows that although AWS is the dominant in the market today, there's still a lot of room for this market to grow. And so I think that's what's so exciting about still talking about cloud infrastructure and cloud spend today. And, if we think about today's environment, it's really a hybrid environment. You have cloud infrastructure on one hand, or public cloud, where oftentimes you see new products and new services being developed and delivered. Then you have on-premises or private cloud or self-managed data centers. This is where often legacy systems sit or highly secure systems. And then you have this vendor SaaS ecosystem that often business units, let's take like HR, for instance, will use Workday, and you have to maintain these as well. So from a maintenance perspective, there's always going to be these multiple environments. And so I think we're seeing it become increasingly hybrid in the landscape. So let's move on to our first chapter, building integrations from AWS to anywhere. And I think it's best to approach this through a popular use case. So we're going to be talking about GDPR and privacy regulations, GDPR and CCPA. So this morning, I was going through my email and I found this email, 6 ways to keep your account secure. And this is sent by a fictional bank that we use here called Cumulus. And so I was thinking, well, I don't have any money in this bank anymore. So, the first thing I want to do is unsubscribe to the emails. That's the starter. But the next thing I want to do is really to kind of make sure that my data is deleted from this bank system. And this is now possible in a lot of locations thanks to privacy regulations like GDPR and CCPA. So GDPR, I think, there's 2 sides to this. I think first, it's a great thing because as users and as our personal information gets sold more and more, it becomes increasingly important for me as a user to do business with businesses and with companies that respect my privacy. So I think that's one side of the coin where I really am for a lot of these regulations. The second side of the coin is that these regulations are very hard to implement sometimes. I think earlier in my career, if someone had come to me and said, okay, we need you to know, like, give us a report of all the systems where we store customer data, I would have just laughed at like the sheer magnitude of how to solve that problem. And it's also pretty crazy that a lot of these requests, right, to like have privacy regulations in place can happen all of a sudden. If we look at GDPR, for instance, where all of a sudden companies had to turn on a dime to protect consumer data, otherwise they would be fined, there's really this whole industry that kind of was generated from GDPR compliance. So kind of, if we go back to the use case, if we break down what this actually means, I, as a consumer, have the opportunity to do two actions here, right? First is I want to unsubscribe and delete my data. And the second is I could provide a copy of the data that they have on hand. So this is what I submit to the business, like Cumulus, the bank that I worked with. And behind the scenes, there's actually a lot of stuff that needs to get done. I need to propagate that request across all my systems, across any deployed in public cloud, any deployed in private cloud, data centers, on-prem, vendor SaaS ecosystem. It's a challenging problem to solve. So for this next part, I'm going to actually hand it over to my counterpart, Jamil, to kind of walk us through exactly what a solution to that might look like.
Thanks, Jason, and hello to everyone who's watching. My name is Jamil Patel, and I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at MuleSoft. Today, I'm really excited to walk you through a solution that we have created using MuleSoft and AWS together that solves the exact problem that Jason just described. For Cumulus to be able to comply with GDPR and CCPA and able to provide copies and delete data as the consumers request it. In this section, we are going to focus on how to build MuleSoft services that can easily work with other AWS services, leveraging the best of both worlds to get your desired outcome faster. So let's dive into it. And before we go into the demo, let's look at the architecture of how everything is set up together. Here, we have the blue icons or the blue boxes describing Mule APIs, and the colored icons for AWS describing different AWS services. When a consumer puts in a GDPR or a CCPA request through a web form, it is submitted to the MyData API. The MyData API is able to erase data or obtain a copy of the data. Whenever it gets a request, it simply forwards the request to the GDPR service. The GDPR service is the heart and soul of this architecture. It forwards the request to an SNS topic. The SNS topic fans out to multiple SQS queues, which are each subscribed by a system API. The system API processes the messages in the queues, deleting or querying the data, and publish a message back to the request success or request failure queues. The GDPR service subscribes to these success and request queues. Whenever it gets messages for success messages, it will create an object in Amazon S3 in the desired region for storing the customer data, and it creates a unique URL that only the customer can access and sends it to the customer via email. Now, let's look at the user experience of how this looks like from a consumer perspective. So here I have the submit GDPR request form open. And here I have Salesforce on one side and a MySQL analytics database on the other side. Let's pick a contact, for instance, Arthur here. I'm going to copy his email and we have the same contact selected in the database. So if we go to our submit a GDPR request, and we are going to monitor the network calls that are being made. Let me use Arthur's email here. And we have the same contact selected in the database. So if we go to our submit a GDPR request, and we are going to monitor the network calls that are being made. Let me use Arthur's email here. And we have the same contact selected in the database. And let's say we get a copy request. Let's press submit. And you can see the My Data API was invoked with the operation equals retrieve. And if we go back to our email and let me delete the old ones, and if we refresh, we just got 2 new emails, and both of them contain links to the data from each of the systems we saw. So one of them contains the data from Salesforce, which is this guy, and the other link contains data from the database, which is this guy. And I automatically have access. You can see the link already has the signatures and Amazon credentials embedded into it. So I'm the only one who can access this URL, and which is sent to my email. And you can also mention the expiry to your customers. Now, if you were to make a similar request to delete a data, again, the same thing, another post request with an operation of delete this time. And if we go back to our systems, you can see we have Arthur selected. And if we refresh our view, Arthur's gone. And again, in the database too, if we refresh our view here with the email here, and now you can see he's gone from here as well. So essentially our contact was deleted and the system worked as expected. Now that we understand how the end experience works, let's look under the hood and see how each of these APIs work. Let's start by looking at how I created the My Data and the GDPR service APIs. To create the APIs, first you start with the design. I was able to do that using the Anypoint Design Center, where I use the Visual API Designer to design these APIs. The Visual API Designer lets you do things with the UI. So here I was able to add a post method to the My Data endpoint and respond with a 201 created and send a response saying a data request was created and check your email. So I was able to do this through the UI, and all the while a RAML and an OS 3 spec automatically got generated for me, so I don't have to worry about writing the specification protocols and how the language works itself. Not only that, I can try this out using our mocking service, so it creates a testing URL which you can share internally and kind of choose your parameters. So let's say we send a retrieve request with this email, we're able to see the response right here. And then finally, we shared it onto Anypoint Exchange to share it with others in the organization. So here it automatically generated a API console for us, where if someone wanted to create a data request, they can look at the post method. They would get code samples to be able to configure this into their own applications. And they can also try the mocking service just like we did in the designer and see how this API works. So I created the My Data API. Similarly, we created the GDPR service API, which has 2 endpoints, copy data and erase data. Copy data to get a copy of your data, and then the erase data to erase your data. And then I consumed these API specifications into Anypoint Studio, which is our desktop IDE to build these applications. And Studio is integrated with Design Center. So when you create a new project, you are essentially able to import your specifications from different locations, and that's what I did here, which is why my Data API right now has a post method which automatically got generated based on the specification I gave. And one of the things I did here is I was able to consume the GDPR service as a connector. I was able to take the erase operation when the request is equal to delete, and then call the copy operation when the request equals copy. And what this API is simply calling these things and also loading a static resource, which is an HTML file, which is what we were looking at while making the requests so this HTML form is also hosted in the My Data API itself. So that was the Experience API. And now let's look at the Process API. And just to orient you in the diagram, this is, we looked at the My Data API, which simply calls this GDPR service. Now we are looking at the GDPR service API. When a new request comes in to copy data or erase data, all it is doing is publishing to the SNS topic. And it is doing so by using the SNS connector that we have in Anypoint platform. So if you look for AWS or Amazon on Anypoint Exchange, you are able to see all the different connectors that we provide for Amazon services like Amazon S3, Amazon SQS, EC2, SNS, S3 Glacier, Kinesis, RDS, DynamoDB. And for the other services that there isn't a connector, you can always use REST API calls or messaging based protocols to integrate with those services as well. But for our use cases, the GDPR service, as you can see, connects to 3 of the Amazon services, the SNS topics. So if you look at our diagram again, SNS to publish to the SNS topic, SQS to subscribe from the SQS queues, and S3 to create a bucket object for the customer data. So going back, whenever a request comes in, we send a publish message essentially to the SNS topic. Configuration or connecting to Amazon is simple. You can provide your access and secret for the IAM role you want to use for this, and we have the configurations for all of the Amazon services that we have here. And first thing, it publishes the message to the SNS topic. Now on the AWS side, so let's look at the SNS page. We have this SNS topic where we publish. It's called GDPR requests. And we have SQS queues. We have 4 queues, one for SFDC, one for the database, one for success, and one for failures. Now, if you open up any of the queues, we can easily create a subscription. So we can select subscribe, and we can create an Amazon SNS topic to subscribe to the queue. We have already done that. So this queue has already been subscribed to the GDPR request SNS topic, this guy. So that's how we set up the connection here from GDPR requests to the top SNS to SQS. And then finally, let's look at the customer API that is connected to Salesforce. So in my studio, I'm going to open up the customer API, which is listening on to the GDPR SFDC queue. So it's using the SQS connector, which has a bunch of operations, and we're using the receive messages operation where we are consuming from the SFDC queue, and then we have a delete operation and a retrieve operation, and both of them have their own flows. The retrieve operation uses the Salesforce connector. So similar to how we have connectors for Amazon, we have a connector for Salesforce that lets you do all the common operations. We use the query operation to retrieve data, and we have a SQL query that brings data from Salesforce based on an ID. And we have a delete flow which deletes data from Salesforce using the delete operation provided in Salesforce connector itself. For errors, if there was an error doing any of these, we publish to the failures queue. We send a message to the GDPR request failure queue. If there is no error, we would move on and send a message to the GDPR success queues. So if we go back to our diagram, if this is the error or success queue, and essentially these APIs will send an error or success notification to this queue, and again go back to the GDPR service. So let's go back to the GDPR service again. They receive these messages. So this is listening to the success request. Whenever a successful request is received from here, if the request type equals to retrieve data, we create an object in S3, again using the S3 connector. This connector also is very useful, lets you do a lot of things like get bucket, create object within bucket, get URLs, change your course configuration, everything that the AWS APIs lets you do. So here I was able to use DataWeave to name the key based on the email and the system that the data is from, and then add the contents as output. Another cool operation is create a pre-signed URI. This can create a URL for me, which I can set custom expiration and encryption with. And then finally, I'm using the email connector, which also comes with MuleSoft. Again, simple email operations. I'm using a Gmail account here. So essentially my username and password, not very tough to configure, and essentially passing on the subject line and the URL that I create here. So that's how we got the two emails that gave us the link to the data that Cumulus had on us. Similarly, for failed request, right now I'm just processing it and sending an email. But in reality, you can configure dead letter queues. You can create different reprocessing strategies to see if something failed, how would you want to process it? So that's how we build all of these APIs. Going back to our diagram, if you look at this, you might wonder, why didn't we just make HTTP calls here and call the APIs that way, just like we did with the experience and the process layer? And the answer is we use the queues and the infrastructure availability of AWS and provide more reliability to the system. Essentially, when, let's say, Salesforce or the data warehouse is down, these requests can be collected in the queues, and whenever the APIs come up, essentially they will start processing it and send the success and the failure queues. You also have added auditability and ability to reprocess things in case things fail. So your request is not lost, and you might have to comply with certain standards which the government has set. So these kinds of things can come in really handy if you build more reliability to this. For the next section, we have built all these services, but for the next section, Jason's going to walk us through how to deploy these integration, either on AWS, or how do the deployment architecture looks like when you deploy these at scale, and how the solution works at scale. So back to you, Jason.
Cool. Thanks, Jamil. So very cool to see. I think, the next chapter we often get questions about is how do we deploy integrations both on AWS and with AWS? And again, I'd kind of like to start with an interesting fact that I kind of came to when I was watching AWS reInvent this week. And that's, AWS is still really heavily investing in infrastructure. One of the announcements that they made was that new chips like the Graviton 2 promise up to 40% better price to performance ratio for their instances. And that's not there was that announcement, but they also announced new chips like Inferentia and Trainium. So there's a lot of investment that AWS is still putting into its infrastructure play to really give us better price to performance ratio and continue investing in that field. And then the second stat I want to kind of shout out is that 2/3 of all cloud containers run on AWS. And containerization and orchestration technology like Docker and Kubernetes have really been seeing increasing adoption and interest in the market. And so to think that AWS has roughly 66.666% of all cloud containers is crazy to me, and is a great testament to the commitment to their infrastructure business. So the first question that we often get when it comes to interoperating MuleSoft and AWS is deployment. What are the options, basically? So first, I'd like to go through some of the common options of deployment for MuleSoft. So on the left here, we have first on-premises, right? You can deploy the Mule runtime, deploy your integrations on-prem. This gives you the most control over infrastructure and network configuration. And if you have an environment that's specific where, due to regulations, it's a no cloud deployment, you can definitely deploy Mule apps on-prem. Then if we go kind of all the way far to the right, we have our best experience, or the most handheld experience, which is the platform as a service, right? Cloud Hub. And here you can deploy your Mule apps where you get the latest product updates and features. There's really zero infrastructure management, and you get all that reliability and security and maintenance kind of provided to you out of the box. So those are our non-AWS deployment models. And then in between here, if you go for more of the infrastructure as a service play, you have kind of two options within the AWS ecosystem. First, you have instances, right? So most commonly, I think most people are aware of EC2. And this is where you can deploy a Mule runtime onto an instance, and you don't have to manage kind of the bare metal servers or the infrastructure, underneath it. So it gives you the benefits of flexible network configuration, plus you get the AWS management that DevOps teams can take advantage of. The next option is you can deploy to containers. And most commonly, this is often thought of as, AWS's container service, EKS. And so it's actually really exciting right now because we just announced and just released Mule runtime support for Anypoint Runtime Fabric on EKS. So now you can deploy Mule runtimes, deploy integrations into an EKS environment, into a Kubernetes cluster managed with EKS. So benefits there is you get this managed Kubernetes experience, and you get all the benefits of containerization technology, like resource isolation or auto scaling of nodes. So those are kind of the different options. And there's a associated list of pros and cons that come with each of them. But you really do have kind of a wide variety of ways to deploy integrations with MuleSoft in AWS. The next question that we kind of get is, okay, now we're deploying, how do we deploy alongside AWS? How do we kind of connect our different environments together? Because as we talked about before, the future really is this hybrid model, right? So you have on-prem, self-managed data centers, you have AWS cloud infrastructure, and then you have MuleSoft Cloud Hub. And one of the most common ways one of the most common use cases is connecting AWS and Cloud Hub. And one option for that is VPC peering. So VPC peering is a common way that you can connect, AWS VPCs together, and the same is true for Cloud Hub. So you can connect them together in that way. One thing to note here is that it must be in the same availability region for Cloud Hub and AWS VPC. Another option for the same use case is to use AWS Direct Connect. So if you already have an AWS Direct Connect location that connects into your AWS account, so both VPCs and the public services, you can use that to connect to a Cloud Hub VPC as well. And one thing to note with this approach, right, is that it can also be used to connect to on-prem. I think a lot of people who are familiar with the AWS networking landscape use AWS Direct Connect to connect from cloud infrastructure onto on-prem. So this kind of fits all those different connections. And then finally, to round out kind of the permutations, another way to connect our on-prem integrations are through AWS VPN from the AWS VPC to on-prem, or an IPsec tunnel from Cloud Hub VPC to on-prem. So the real conclusion here, right, is there are a lot of ways to connect between AWS Cloud, MuleSoft Cloud Hub, on-prem, self-managed data centers. So no matter where your integrations are deployed, they'll be able to interoperate between your other infrastructures, which is really key for any hybrid environment. So now to kind of see what this looks like, see what deployments look like in Anypoint platform, I'm going to again pass it off to Jamil to walk us through the deploy experience in Anypoint platform.
Thanks, Jason, for walking us through all the different deployment options and the network connectivity options that we provide. In the next section, we'll use this knowledge and try to apply that to our use case and see how the GDPR use case we talked about earlier can benefit from this. So the first thing is deployment. Deploying from Anypoint Studio is as simple as right-clicking on the project and selecting Deploy to Cloud Hub. If you are using Cloud Hub as your deployment model. You can also configure CI/CD pipelines. There is a Git plugin that lets you create like your commits to Git, and you can create hooks to have Jenkins get triggered on each of your commits and build and redeploy to any of your deployment targets. But as simple as giving it a unique name, Cloud Hub supports the AWS global deployment region, so you have all the different regions available here. and you also can select as many workers you want to run this application on if you want redundancy, and you can also scale your applications vertically by adding number of vcores and memory to it. Now, what we have done in our use case is MuleSoft also supports for Cloud Hub deployed apps. You can create VPCs from the runtime manager. So we have put all of these Mule APIs into the same VPC in the same region, US East 2, and then the topics, queues, buckets, everything that we created, all the AWS services that we created, we kept it in the same region. So essentially, we have minimal latency between all of these, and then the VPC can be configured to have like a dedicated load balancer connected to it, which essentially forwards and sends requests to these services, and instead of using the shared load balancer that Cloud Hub provides. So we have configured all of these setup for our system to work more efficiently, and as you can see, if I can show you the S3 bucket. We can see all the emails that we are requesting data for, all of them either from Salesforce or the Analytics DB. The records are being created in the US East 2 region, but we can also make it dynamic so that it, depending on where the customer is, you can essentially create the bucket in the same region, so you can serve them the information faster or even store them near them so that they can access it faster. The other huge benefit of deploying to any point platform is visualizer. So essentially, I have deployed all of these applications to Cloud Hub and enabled monitoring for it, which gives me an added layer of an auto-generated view. So the same diagram that we saw earlier, the GDPR diagram, is now also available in Visualizer based on the actual data that is flowing. So you can see the user can initiate the My Data request, which invokes the GDPR service, and the GDPR service is invoking email, S3, SNS. The connection from SNS to SQS lies within AWS. So we can't really see it in Visualizer, but you can see from SQS, you're sending it to both the system APIs, which is going to the database, and Salesforce. So you can see all your APIs in one view in the architecture view. If something were to go wrong, you can filter on this troubleshooting view, which can give you different metrics of like what the failure was. You can click on an individual API and see essentially failure count, request count. We saw the 4 requests that we sent earlier, and you can see the latencies going through between them as well. Now, let's look at Runtime Manager, where you can see all of your applications that you deploy in a single pane of glass. So here we have all of our APIs, and they are all deployed to Cloud Hub. I have deployed a sample app to RTF on EKS just to showcase that part as well. But all of our APIs are here, and they're in the same VPC. And how did I do that? Essentially, you can go to the VPCs tab, create a VPC, where you can select the name, the region, the CIDR block for your IP addresses, and then what business groups you want to associate it with. You can select or block certain ports, forward different things, add your DNS server IPs and domains here, and just simply select create VPC. We have already done that. And since this is a default VPC, any app that we deploy in this environment will automatically get deployed to this VPC here. The other thing you can do is create a load balancer. We haven't actually went ahead and created it, but you can easily create it using the load balancers tab. You can select your target VPC here, which is our demo VPC. We can create sample LB, and you can support your TLS 1 or 2 and then add your certificates for your root and CA certificates, and then create the load balancer that way, which can then start using your certs and your own domain instead of using the shared load balancer. So whenever you create applications this way, you also have the ability to access the application through this URL that Cloud Hub provides, but it uses a shared load balancer. So if you don't want to use that, and if you want to use your own, you can certainly use the shared load balancer here. Jason also talked about the VPNs. Those are also just similar to how we created a VPC. You can create a VPN. So for instance, if you're connecting my data center VPN, you can select your VPC that you want to connect. So for instance, let's say we wanted to connect our Cloud Hub deployed apps to on-prem systems. If we go back to a diagram, let's say this data warehouse system needed to connect to a database which is on-prem. You would connect a VPN to this VPC, which will connect to your on-prem system, and you can easily call those databases as well. And then in terms of deploying this, you can easily deploy these APIs to an EC2 instance. So you can say add server, and you can run this script into an EC2 server, and it will automatically detect it and kind of bring it here, and you can deploy your Mule applications on that runtime. The other alternative is to create runtime fabrics. So when you create runtime fabrics, we have recently started supporting Amazon EKS, Azure Kubernetes Service AKS, and then bare metals, which is just like using Kubernetes and Docker. So in this case, I've created one with, let me just show you the process. Sample EKS, let's use Amazon, and then you select next, and you accept, and it gives you this activation key. And the next step is you create your EKS cluster and apply the activation key with our single command line utility we have called RTFCTL. And just with one command, you are able to set up this runtime fabric, which is a container solution with which you can deploy now. If I go to application, since I have created this runtime fabric, when I have hit deploy application, I have two deployment targets now. I can either deploy on Cloud Hub, which is managed by MuleSoft, or deploy to this EKS cluster, which I manage, and I would have to make sure if I am running updates, I have to set up CloudTrail and monitor the infrastructure and whatnot for that. So that's how we have set up the deployment for all of our applications. The ultimate key here is flexibility. You saw we were able to create VPCs, we were able to connect them to VPNs, we were able to connect them to load balancers. We are able to deploy to Cloud Hub, which supported the same regions as AWS. You can also deploy on EC2 using servers. And then finally, you can also use Runtime Fabric and deploy there. So when it comes to deployment, you have all different options. And for all of these options, you can enable monitoring and essentially get insights into the Mule apps right away, because our deployment models also support log forwarding to our monitoring infrastructure, which automatically can generate views like this. And you get a complete picture of how your systems are talking with each other and interacting. And in case something were to go wrong, this is the first place you can start looking at. By this time, we have talked about building with AWS. We have also talked about deploying integrations on or with AWS. And in this final chapter, I'm going to call back Jason to talk about scale and reuse. Once you have built and deployed this, how do you scale and reuse these integrations to get the most mileage across your organizations? Jason, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jamil. So finally, I want to talk about scaling, which is ironically one of the biggest challenges faced by AWS devs, is how to scale, which is not the infrastructure scale, but actually scaling development expertise through project reuse, being able to reuse components project after project. So first, let's go back to our friendly architecture diagram, and I'm going to show you a couple ways in which adopting an architecture like this really helps you scale. So the first is, we can tap into the classic reusability of APIs. At the top of the experience layer, we can reuse our My Data API if we were to add on new ways to submit personal data requests. So in this case, we've split our requests into a web request experience and a mobile request experience, both using the My Data API. So that's one use case. Second, if we were to say, modernize our reporting and kind of upgrade our data warehouse to a cloud native data warehouse like Amazon Redshift, that's something that can be really easily done with this architecture as well. So we can switch out this particular data warehouse to a cloud data warehouse. And this is very easy because we're only changing one part of the architecture. So only the reporting API needs to be changed and no other piece needs to be touched. So we can reuse all those other components that we built for our other broader use case, right? Third, let's say we add, a new system to this integration because it contains personal information that is relevant to GDPR. So here I've included DocuSign as a repository of our official documents and signatures, which personal information. And as you can see, I'm able to integrate it by just building one more API at the system layer. And it's very easy for me to scale out Amazon SQS to include another GDPR queue subscribed to the exact same topic. And then finally, fourth, what if, let's say, a new regulation hits the market? And this is actually happening here in San Francisco, where I live, in the US with CCPA, which for those of you unaware is the California Consumer Privacy Act. So if you do business in both California and in Europe, you now have to handle both regulations of protecting consumers' privacy. So in this specific case, you can add a new CCPA service to the process layer. And again, we can reuse all the other components. So it's as simple as, hooking into that existing API, the existing APIs, and just scaling out the topics and the queues, which is all really easy to do with AWS infrastructure. So the real takeaway here is that with an architecture like this, with an API-led approach to integration, it becomes very easy to scale out and reuse integration components project after project, which is really powerful and really important for modern organizations. Okay, so now we've concluded looking at how to build, deploy, and scale. So what's next? First, I want to share 3 customers who are using MuleSoft and AWS today. We have Arc Publishing, which is part of the Washington Post, and they're using MuleSoft's connectivity to services like S3, SQS, and SNS, like we mentioned in today's webinar, to build faster and to really scale through service reuse. We have AT&T, who recently shared in one of our developer meetups how they're deploying across hybrid environments, AWS included, and they show off some of the VPC peering that we talked about today. And then Buffalo Wild Wings is another example. They're building resiliency into their services using a similar approach to what we looked at today by integrating SQS queues into their APIs. And if you want to learn more about MuleSoft and AWS together, we actually just released a white paper talking further about how you can look at extending AWS capabilities. It includes, conversations about Lambda functions, another hot topic in the AWS ecosystem, AWS step functions, really popular for AWS integration, and really shares the full story of Arc Publishing, which is a really exciting story to read about. And second, we also just released a new developer tutorial on connecting S3 and Salesforce together. So I'd recommend you take a look at that as well if you're looking to get your hands dirty with the product. So that will be included in the additional resources that we send out as well. Cool. So I want to thank everyone again for attending the webinar today. I really appreciate it. We both really appreciate it. And now we'll move into some Q&A. Okay. Hey, everyone. So as mentioned, please, keep submitting your questions through the submit a question widget. We've already got a good amount of questions coming in, so thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and kind of kick this off with some some ones that maybe we've already answered. So again, I just want to repeat, if you need to get a copy of this presentation, the recording will be emailed to you after the event. So check that out. And then we had another question around one of our customers is working from batch processing for PeopleSoft to Workday, and they're using SNS fanning out to SQS, so similar to what we did in the webinar. And due to the order of processing requirements, they want to use first in, first out for SNS, and currently the Mule connector doesn't support that. So they were just wondering if we were looking to support that in the future. So thank you, Michael, for the question. I don't have an update on when we will support that in the future. I know that's a popular request. One thing that you mentioned in your question was also that you created kind of an enhancement request on the ideas portal. And that's currently the way that we're tracking enhancement requests in the future. So thank you for doing that. And I just wanted to share that with everyone else so that if you have any other questions or features that you would like to see, please go to the ideas portal and submit them there, because that's how our product team prioritizes. Next, I want to move on to another question that was answered. This one was by Spencer. So Spencer was asking, when will Mule runtime support AWS EKS? And Jamil, I think you answered this one. You want to go for that?
Sure. Yeah. The short answer is yes, and I'm really excited for this because EKS just went open source, which means you can run EKS anywhere on AWS or on-prem or wherever you like. And Runtime Fabric now supports EKS, which means essentially you can run Runtime Fabric anywhere. So I'm really excited to see this. And this was the first time I personally installed RTF on EKS, and it was fairly easy. So compared to, because EKS does all the provisioning for you and the worker nodes and everything. So it was fairly easy just provisioning all the infrastructure with one command and then running the installation with the other. The only one caveat when you're setting up RTF on EKS is the ingress node. Typically, if you're used to using Runtime Fabric, we use the Mule ingress. But when you use EKS or other like AKS and other flavors of RTF deployment, since you have to use Kubernetes ingress, you have to set up an ingress node. And in this case, I set up Nginx, simple to set up, but just something to look after.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. And yeah, we're really excited. We announced both EKS and AKS support. So again, not the focus of this webinar, but if you're also running on Azure, you can try that out as well. Okay, our next question is from Ashish, and they were wondering the difference between SNS and Anypoint MQ, which you may have heard us refer to. So yeah, SNS and MQ are both messaging. Anypoint MQ are both messaging services. And so the purposes of this use case, you could swap out either to achieve the same result. And like, any choice of broker, if you're using RabbitMQ or ActiveMQ or like any type of MQ or messaging service, there's a list of like pros and cons. So I think for using Anypoint MQ, the one that MuleSoft offers, the main advantage is having that more closely coupled integration with Anypoint platform. So you can take advantage of some of the provisioning and the monitoring and the management directly from the platform, as opposed to having to go to a different tool. But we chose to show SQS here to kind of highlight the interoperability with the Amazon ecosystem. So yeah, Jamil, do you have anything to add there?
Just on your previous note about FIFO queues, Anypoint MQ does support FIFO queues. So the other use case you were talking about, perhaps that could also work with Anypoint MQ.
Nice, that's good to know. And the next one here, question. Okay, so Spencer was, go for it, Jamil.
I'm seeing a lot of questions around like asking about why not use AWS Lambda instead of using a Mule application at the system layer. And I think that was like a very good question because you can also subscribe SQS queues to AWS Lambda functions, and you can just have it invoke sort of the system API instead of building it on any point platform. And you can certainly do that. What I found was when I thought about building the Lambdas, I would have to connect to different vendor systems, and I need connectivity to these vendor systems. I need a connector or some sorts of, or if it's Salesforce, I might have to call it REST APIs. And I found it like if I were to like write a program or some sort of like code for it, it might be not as like easy to do and also as fast to do. So I just preferred to use the Mule way, and I used Anypoint Studio for deployment. But that's like I feel like the biggest choice of deployment or difference between the two is essentially the build tools you get to build things. For the Lambda, you just write your own connectivity, you write your own. The other challenge I saw was Lambdas often use functional programming languages, and I'm sometimes you might get intimidated seeing a lot of functional programming code because unless you understand it, it's hard to dig into the layers and see what it's doing. Versus with Mule, you can still use event-driven processing and not have to worry about the complexity of how it looks like. So that was like what I found when I was comparing the two. But I think it's a developer choice, so it's based on what you like building on, and I think both of them are viable options as well.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I was gonna queue up, and I wanted to add to that, like the white paper that we had just mentioned at the end of the webinar there. In that white paper, we kind of talk about some of the ways in which MuleSoft customers are using both Lambda and Mule together, right? I think it's not an either or situation, right? It's something that can be used together, and we're not in the business of ever replacing serverless like Lambda functions. So yeah, I would recommend really checking out the white paper there, and maybe in the future it could be interesting to really go deep into Lambda and serverless functions on MuleSoft. So I'll have to think about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would be a nice topic.
Yeah. Okay, another question that came in was from Bill, and Bill was asking about transformation. So can transformations be applied to the execution tier? For example, if I load values in euros, can I transfer the value to USD before the presentation tier? Further, can I create custom transformations based upon the caller? So Bill, I'll take a stab, and then maybe if Jamil has anything to add, but I think the answer is yes. Transformations can be done at any of the APIs, any layer. One of the tools that we provide is called DataWeave, which is an expression language to kind of handle data transformations like that. I do know that currency transformations are a bit tricky, right? Because the exchange rate fluctuates so frequently, and you always want to make sure to have the most recent one. So what I've heard in the past is popular for customers to either completely offload currency transactions and exchanges to another system that's kind of purpose-built for that. Or, I think you can make API calls to that system and kind of do the transformations dynamically, which is maybe what you were getting to at the end of your question there. Anything to add there, Jamil?
No.
Cool. Take some other questions. Do you see any that
lot of about RTF on EKS. If you want to learn how to do that, we have the docs updated to do how to get the installation steps. So the Punker, you can find your steps there.
Yeah, there's another question here on what connectors do we have for AWS services. And so I think Jamil had shown that very briefly in one of the demos. That was, we have a number of connectors. So there's S3, S3 Glacier, DynamoDB, Amazon Kinesis, SQS, SNS. Hope I don't forget any of them. RDS as well. I think that's it. I might be forgetting one or two. Don't hold me to it, but yeah, and we're continuing to invest in like more AWS services coming in. So Kinesis streaming was kind of the most recent one that was released at the end of or last month in November, and then we also improved, I believe it was SQS to include larger payload sizes, like 2 gigabytes, I want to say. So yeah. Okay. We have another question. Can we build a user interface, the UI, in the experience layer along with the APIs? Yes. So I think the experience layer is kind of an abstract concept, right? More for architecture building. Typically, we put UIs, interfaces above the experience layer. So you saw in our diagram, we had like web requests or mobile requests kind of attaching or, making a request to one of the experience, one of the APIs in the experience layer. But yeah, I think the way you structure the diagram can be, up to you. This is maybe a good one. So another question was from, I would like to understand best practices in using AWS or CI/CD with Mule applications. Jamil, do you know if we have any good resources out there for AWS and CI/CD?
That's a good question. Not with AWS. We typically just I think a good deployment model would have to have like some sort of like a Terraform script that would like provision all the AWS things and then run some sort of a Jenkins script to do the Mule deployments. I don't think we have like a ideal webinar or such tutorial, but we do have recommended practices on how to set up things with Git and Jenkins, and then you can essentially Google like how to like add AWS to the mix. And I'll talk to like our developer relations team to like talk about think about this topic and write some sort of a tutorial about it, because it's a good area that we can write a tutorial for.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think there's, don't quote me on this again, but I want to say it's either there is one or it's coming soon. I think I've seen some tutorial or some resource around deploying Mule with Maven and Jenkins, and I think even like some other like Ant, but I don't know if we have one on AWS. So yes,
yeah.
echo the sentiment.
I see another question from Pankti about how the APIs are secured. For the POC, I didn't really like put crazy security on my APIs, but for the HTTP ones, you can add a policy. You can set up auto discovery, add them to API manager, and add a policy for client ID enforcement, OAuth 2, whatever is your preferred choice or your company standard. And then for the ones that were just listening, the system APIs, all they were doing is listening to queue, I believe. So they did not expose any open ports. So there was very less, I would say, attack vectors to it, apart from your credentials being stolen or your worker being compromised, which is if you're deploying to Cloud Hub, MuleSoft take care of all the other security, the DDoS protection and whatnot. So that's why the system APIs there did not have any policies applied either.
Nice. Yeah, and I see a couple questions about kind of getting access to the demo assets. Typically, we don't provide access to the demo assets, but I don't know, Jamil, if you had other plans.
Yeah, right now I just like put in my credentials in a way, and I haven't created a Git repo, but I'm happy to create a Git repo and follow up. So I think I might have to do it anyways. A lot of people have asked about it. So I will create a Git repo and put it out there so some of you might be able to find it.
Cool, awesome. So TBD. I think another question was for the visualizer part you showed, which is one of the things that I love demoing in any platform was, is that automatically created? And right, the answer there is yes, as long as you enable monitoring when you're deploying your Mule apps, that tree structure where you can see all the connections between APIs is automatically generated. So that's a really cool feature as well.
Yeah, I agree. I was delighted to see it when I deployed all my applications, because that's how I verified that all my applications are working as I planned for. So that was another thing that I did, because I got more validation when I saw the diagrams pop up. It kind of gave more validation on if the whole system worked as expected.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so I think we're at time now, so I think we're gonna end the webinar. But thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much for all the questions. We definitely didn't get to all of them because there was so much engagement. So thank you again for coming. Look out for a follow-up email, and if you have any other feedback or questions, feel free to connect with us. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks.